Hello everybody, and welcome to this presentation. I've been invited to give you today about a particular study I have been involved in Australia, a research study which focused on sign language interpreting provided remotely in courts in the state of New South Wales, and in particular in Sydney, in the city where I live. So I'll be walking you through the whole of the research project and our findings, but also primarily just to emphasise how relevant the findings are more broadly. So even though I'm talking specifically today about a study that was done in a legal context, I actually think that the study has wider implications for video remote interpreting, VRI, in any context. So just to give you some background initially, we know that video remote interpreting is being used a lot more widely, primarily in the United States, but in other countries throughout the world. Many services are being provided for deaf people through VRI for different purposes, and we're seeing a huge explosion in VRS services, so video relay services, where deaf people can make phone calls and make other kind of conference calls through the video medium, which we know makes a huge impact on their ability to communicate, because now deaf people are being able to communicate directly in their chosen sign language rather than using text-based communication through national relay phone services and so on. So the development of video remote interpreting has had an impact not only on the deaf community but also on us as sign language interpreters as well. There hasn't been that much research though. There's been quite a few presentations, conference presentations and discussions, and Gallaudet hosted a symposium a couple of years ago where people are coming together and talking about the issues that we face, and practitioners in particular are talking about the experiences that we're having as sign language interpreters, because we're noticing the difference, that we're working through a video medium and it's different from working face-to-face with a deaf client who's right there in the room with you. So we're starting to talk about it, but there's not that much research that's been done to really try and inform us better on what we can do, so then that information can be incorporated into training of interpreters, but also incorporated into information sharing with other end users, so not just the sign language interpreters but also the deaf community and other hearing people that will rely on accessing interpreting services through this medium as well. Marty Taylor has done some research, a couple of research studies on VRS. Also Jeremy Brunson published a book just last year in 2011 based on his PhD research, which looked at video remote services and the perceptions of interpreters and being involved in providing interpreting services through those mediums. And there's one other major study that's been done in the United Kingdom. A woman called Christine Wilson in Edinburgh has been looking at how VRI impacts on police interviews specifically, so that's a very specific legal context. Her results are not yet published, but she's finding very similar things to what we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about today, as a result of the study that we did in Australia. So, Australia, just to give you a bit of background. We are very new to VRI and VRS in Australia. We know that in America the services have been much better established and for a longer period of time, and they're much more widely used. The Australian Communication Exchange is a major organisation which used to provide our text telephone relay service, or what we call the NRS, the National Relay Service, and they did a trial of a VRS back in 2000 actually, but back then we still don't have a national broadband network, so many parts of Australia still, people still rely on dial-up to access internet service. So for many parts of Australia it's just not feasible for people to be able to access a VRS service because the broadband, the speed, the download, upload speeds just aren't fast enough. So a trial was done back in 2000, and they did recommend that for people living in regional and remote areas that VRS could be a very effective way for deaf people to get access to information and to be able to communicate more freely. But the main sticking point at that time was the technology. Since that time, the Department of Human Services, which is under the state of Victoria in Australia, as part of their government, they actually trialled a video remote interpreting service where they had different rooms set up where interpreters could be present, and then deaf people could call in. They could go to a particular room set up in their local vicinity, and they could call in to another place. And they actually created the suites and tailored them, and what we would call a bespoke suite, so that all of the technological conditions were right. And they found that the service and the consumer satisfaction was really, really effective. The satisfaction was very high. The interpreters were happy. They noted that there were some technological glitches here and there, but generally they found that the service was very effective, but it wasn't taken up much. It wasn't taken up as much as they expected, and they thought that that was probably due to lack of information or lack of awareness, and people just adapting to change, to a new service being available. But ultimately they felt that it was something that they could provide for deaf consumers or the deaf population in the state of Victoria. The same organisation I mentioned earlier, the Australian Communication Exchange, are also now trialling a VRS service in Australia. So at the moment any deaf person can access VRS from 10 until 12, or 10 till 2 actually I think it is, and Monday to Friday. So we're still in the very preliminary stages of deaf people being able to access a VRS service in Australia, but it's been very well received, people like it, and the main sticking point, as there usually is funding. So what the organisation are doing is trialling the service in order to collect evidence to then take to the government for them to fund a national video relay service, which then will be made available 24/7. So that's the kind of background of where we're coming from in Australia and why this study was necessary. There's been no study, no research of any sign language interpreting provided remotely in legal contexts in Australia. It is starting to be used, but it's never been studied until we were actually asked to do this particular project. So the project I'm going to talk to you about was conducted by Macquarie University, by myself and a team of research assistants at Macquarie University in Sydney, in Australia. And the project was actually commissioned by the Department of Justice and Attorney General in New South Wales. It's part of the New South Wales government, and they're responsible for the whole legal system in our state, all the courts and so on. And they had identified that there were problems in providing sign language interpreters in courts in the state of New South Wales due to availability of interpreters, due to the length of time the interpreters were needed, and also the proximity of interpreters to courthouses and to where the deaf people were placed. So in regional and rural areas, for example, there are very few qualified sign language interpreters who are appropriate to work in court. We have a 2-tier accreditation system in Australia. So if you're called a paraprofessional interpreter, you can work in the community, but you can only work in court if you're accredited at the professional level, so at the higher level. And in many country towns, there are none, or maybe only one, professional interpreter around. And if you imagine a deaf person needing to go to court, they might need a 1 or 2 week trial. So there are huge implications and cost implications too when interpreters have to be provided from a city area, have to be flown out and accommodated in a country area. So there are lots of different issues that have been identified as to why trials are being postponed and delayed because of the provision of sign language interpreting. So they wanted to look at whether they could provide sign language interpreting for criminal trials primarily through the video system that they had. And in the New South Wales courts, they refer to it as an audio-visual link. It's a video conference system, and it's embedded within all of the courts throughout the state of New South Wales. And they call it audio-visual link, or AVL. So throughout the rest of this presentation, I'll be talking about AVL specifically because I'm talking about the system that we tested in the New South Wales courts. And they commissioned me to run this study because before they implemented new policy, they actually wanted to test whether it worked, what didn't, and make recommendations which would inform the policy rather than just leaping straight in and offering this service via video remote. So we were lucky that we actually had people within the department who have worked with the deaf community and with the Sign Language Interpreting Association on various issues to do with legal interpreting. So they were already very aware that they couldn't just jump in head first and offer a service without testing the water first, which was a good thing. So the goal of the project was to, first of all, test the provision of sign language interpreting through this AVL system, the in-house AVL system, and we wanted to test a range of scenarios. So we worked with the Department of Justice to identify what the most typical scenarios would be. Where would a deaf person be? Where would the interpreter be? How would the AVL system be used realistically? And we wanted to make sure that we tested each of those conditions. We wanted to assess any issues that arose, any challenges that arose within each of those scenarios, identify what those issues were, and also try and get the perceptions of the key stakeholders involved. So talk to the interpreters, talk to the deaf clients, and also talk to any of the legal personnel involved in the courtroom to assess their perceptions of whether the whole thing was working well or not, and if there were any issues that arose for them, and if they had the same perceptions or different perceptions about what those issues were. So the way that we designed the study, we called it a kind of quasi-experimental study, because if you're going to do a true experimental study, you design a form of data collection and then you have it controlled under controlled conditions, and then you replicate that over various different instances, and then you can directly compare. But because we were looking at slightly different scenarios, you couldn't call it a typical experimental situation. So it's more of a qualitative study. We wanted to look at what was happening within each of the 5 scenarios as a kind of case study within its own right. But we did develop each scenario under the same kind of conditions. So we made sure, we wanted to make them as realistic as possible. Ideally, we would have gone in and observed authentic situations, but because at the time, when we actually conducted the study, it was in 2010, so at the time the AVL system wasn't being used yet to provide sign language interpreting in New South Wales courts, and also there's all these ethical issues around getting permission from deaf defendants and the lawyers and the interpreters involved in a real case to be able to observe and document what was happening. So we felt that in order to test the situation, we had to develop an experimental conditions and involve various people to try and replicate as closely as we could what would happen in a real court case. There were 3 stages, if you like. So we had sort of scripted scenarios where we acted out a short hearing, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but we filmed the whole thing. So we actually had interpreters and deaf people and people who volunteered to act as the legal personnel. Unfortunately, we couldn't get any real legal personnel because we didn't have the budget to pay them to come. But we got people who worked for the Department of Justice who were very familiar, worked as clerks and in other roles, who were able to act in the role of barristers and judges and so on. So we conducted mini trials, which each one went for about 15 minutes or so. We filmed those. We had film cameras in the different locations, because sometimes a deaf person or an interpreter was in a remote location, so we had cameras there too. And we then had what you call fieldwork notes. So the researchers who were doing the filming and setting things up were also then observing the whole trial, making notes, ethnographic notes throughout the mini trial. And then we also had retrospective interviews with the deaf people and the interpreters and the legal personnel. So we created a lot of data that needed to be analysed, but it was really worthwhile because it gave us a much more holistic view, I think, of what was happening and what the key issues were for us to consider. So we tested key venues. So thinking back to what I said earlier on about thinking about the scenarios where this AVL system would realistically be used, we knew that there would be a need in the courtrooms themselves. So deaf people were in the courtroom if they themselves were on trial or a witness, for example. They might be in a remote witness room. This is commonly used in New South Wales courts where there is a particular challenge somebody doesn't want to be in the physical presence of somebody else involved in a trial. There's lots of different reasons why somebody might give evidence via a remote witness room, which is either located in the same building or in a different part of the country or a different part of the state. We identified that there were 2 different video remote facilities that might be used where an interpreter could be based. So one of them was the Deaf Society of New South Wales. That's a community-run, sort of based organisation which provides interpreting services, and they occasionally provide sign language interpreting services to the courts in New South Wales, and they have an in-house video remote interpreting suite. So we tested that facility. We also tested the facility of the New South Wales Community Relations Commission, and that's a government-funded translation and interpreting service for all languages, so spoken and sign language. And they provide all interpreters for courts, any legal meetings, police, court, mediations, the Refugee Review Tribunal. They are responsible for providing interpreting services to all of those. They work very closely with the New South Wales Deaf Society, so if they can't find interpreters, they'll work with the Deaf Society to provide them, or the Deaf Society will identify deaf interpreters to work in a deaf hearing relay team if and when they're required. So the Community Relations Commission also has a video remote interpreting suite, which we also wanted to test. So we had those, and then we also had the 5th venue, which was the jail. So you might have somebody who's on remand, for example, and is waiting for a bail hearing. So one of the other issues that had been identified by the department was having to transport prisoners to court for maybe a 5-minute hearing, or a bail condition hearing or something. So they also wanted to test whether the deaf person could stay in the remote video suite, AVL suite, in the jail and have the interpreter in the courtroom. So that was another combination that we looked at. So altogether we were looking at testing 5 different venues. So to tell you a bit more about the data collection, how we actually collected the data, we had 2 mock trial scripts which were based on real trials, and they were provided to us by the Department of Justice, and we adapted them slightly just to make sure that any issues that we would expect to come up that might be challenging for interpreters were covered. So for example, finger spelling of names, street names, places, numbers, and a few other kind of technical details were included in the scripts just to make sure that there might be a couple of little challenges there for the interpreters, so that we could see how they could deal with those via that sort of video remote connection. We had professional deaf actors involved, and they were given a brief on their character, who they were playing, why they were in the courtroom. We also had professional interpreters, so all of the interpreters that we had were accredited at that professional level, but they had varying amounts of court interpreting experience, and we felt that this was realistic because you have somebody who has maybe 20 years experience. We had one person who had interpreted in court several times but didn't do a lot of court work, and then we had one interpreter who had never been in a courtroom before and was more newly accredited. And in Australia we felt that this was quite a realistic representation of what might happen in certain areas where a court case comes up or a hearing comes up, and because of the availability of interpreters, the key qualifier is that someone has the right level of accreditation. Ideally they'll look for people that have court interpreting experience, but that doesn't always happen. So we felt that this was a good representation of who's out there in the workforce. And as I mentioned earlier on, we had volunteers from the Department of Justice to act in the roles of the hearing people, so as the barristers, the lawyers, and also as the judge and any other personnel who were around. The deaf and hearing participants all received the script beforehand, and they were given a brief though to try and make the interactions as naturalistic as possible. We didn't want them to stick so closely to the script that if there was a misinterpretation that they still followed the script, because then there's no possibility for communication breakdown, because as you know, if there is any misinterpretation or if there's any issue with the interpreter not being able to see, for example, a finger spelt name, they would need to seek clarification. So we would want the deaf person to respond appropriately, and the hearing person too. So we advise them to follow the script as long as what they were receiving through the interpretation reflected what they were expecting to receive and was kind of close to what was in the script. If it deviated any way, they should deviate. So if, for example, the deaf person was asked their name and they replied John Smith, and the interpreter conveyed that as James Smith, then the lawyer should question that. And then once they clarified that information, they would go back to the script and continue. So we felt that was the best way to have a kind of controlled situation where everybody knew what they were doing and it was realistic and reflecting a real trial, but that we allowed for the communicative nature of relying on an interpreter. The interpreters received a lot less briefing, and we felt this was realistic. We know through the Community Relations Commission, and I've had personal experience of this myself, you get booked to turn up at court and you get given the client's name and the type of case it is or the type of hearing it is, and if you're lucky, the name of a contact person at the courtroom. And usually you'll endeavour to get there early enough to meet with the deaf person if you can, or at least to find out some information about the court case from the lawyers, but that's behaviour on you as the interpreter when you get there. So we actually provided them with pretty much the same information in this instance, because we felt that if the interpreters were provided with this information in the real world, they would then seek out that information once they arrived, and most of them did. As soon as they arrived, they sought out all of the information that they could get. So we filmed 5 scenarios. You'll see on the PowerPoint slide it actually has 6 in brackets, and that's because we actually refilmed one of them because we realised that the technician had turned up the bandwidth on the AVL system, and we didn't want him to do that. He did it to improve the clarity of the visual feed. We wanted to ensure that we were testing the conditions so that if a court case was happening, a deaf person turned up, the interpreter turned up, any court clerk should literally be able to press the on switch for the video remote facility, for the AVL facility, and everything would proceed. They shouldn't have to fiddle with any of the mechanisms or any of the bandwidths or anything like that, because they wouldn't have that technological know-how and you couldn't rely on that always happening. So we wanted to test the more realistic nature of literally switching it on and see what happens. So we actually refilmed one of the scenarios to using that condition where we literally just switched it on, and we found the same result. So the fact that the technician had increased the bandwidth didn't really affect the outcome of the interaction and the trial. It didn't make that much difference in the long run. So we filmed these 5 different scenarios over 3 locations. So there was the courthouse, and then we used 2 different remote witness rooms, one remote witness room and 2 different video conference suites in the interpreting agencies. So we technically it was over 4 different locations, but it was 3 different types of locations. So an agency-based video remote interpreting suite, a remote witness room, and that could also double up as if it was a jail as well, because it's the same kind of conditions as what you would find in the jail remote witness room and in the courtroom itself. As I mentioned earlier, we did a follow-up interview. So after each scenario was filmed, we did a quick interview with all of the participants and then moved on to the next scenario. So we actually filmed all the scenarios in one day, and so we had lots of different people at different places on the phone and communicating to make sure everything was happening. But each of the trial scenarios operated out of the same courtroom throughout the day. I'll just quickly go through the scenarios just to explain who was where, and you'll see that over the 5 we had, first of all, deaf person in the court, interpreter remotely. Then we had interpreter in the court, deaf person remote. We had deaf person and the interpreter together but in a remote witness room going into the courtroom. We had a control situation where we actually had the deaf person and the interpreter in the courtroom together, so that was the face-to-face. So we did that as a control so we could compare it. And we also had a scenario where we had the deaf person in a remote witness room, the interpreter in a video remote interpreting suite, and the courtroom. So there were three different locations in those instances. So what we were looking at was the combinations of deaf person and interpreter together, deaf person and interpreter apart, but one of them being in the courtroom and the other remotely, and then also the deaf person and the interpreter both in remote situations. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what we found in each of those scenarios. So now that I've described how we collected the data and all of the conditions that we put in place, let me talk to you about each of the 5 scenarios, and I'll describe a little bit about the scenario itself, and you'll get to see some pretty pictures, and then I'll tell you a bit more about what we found, and I'll just summarise some of the core issues that we found. And I have provided a couple of references for reading, so if you're interested in reading up a bit more about the study and getting some more detail, there is more detail available for you in a couple of different publications that you can follow up with. So for now I'll talk about the scenarios and then sum up with the core issues and some recommendations. So scenario 1, this is over 3 locations. You'll see on the PowerPoint slide that there are 2 pictures. One actually depicts what could be seen on each of the video screens. Now, one of the key things that we were testing was the inbuilt AVL system in the New South Wales courts. So you have to remember that we were working under those conditions. We weren't able to change what we had. And with the inbuilt AVL system, in the courtroom you would have a large plasma screen on the wall. You would have fixed cameras. So this was the key. Above the plasma screen, you would have 3, 4, maybe 5 cameras above the television screen, but each of them were fixed. So one was focused on the judge's bench, one was focused on the witness box, one was on the bar where the lawyers sit, the defence and the prosecution lawyers, and one, for some reason, we're not quite sure why, was actually focused on the public gallery, so where people sit behind the bar tables. These cameras could not be shifted, so you couldn't actually move the cameras anyway on a different location in the courtroom, and you could not zoom in and out on those cameras either. So we had to test those conditions. We had to test what could be done with that technology, the way that it was set up. So that's a caveat before I proceed. One of the other things about the AVL system is that there was only certain views that you could get on the screen. Depending on where you were and which button you pressed, you would get a combination of different views. So you could either look at the view from 1 camera, or 2 cameras, or 3 cameras. And given we were testing either the deaf person or the interpreter being in different locations, we had to make sure, for example, that if the deaf person and the interpreter were both remote, that the judge needed to be able to see both of them, and people in the court need to be able to see both of them. So they would flick a switch, press a button, the technological person did that, but to make sure that they could see everybody. So what you see on this PowerPoint for scenario 1, in the square on your left-hand side, when you're looking at the screen, you'll see in the top quadrant, if you like, that's the view of the judge's bench, where the judge is sitting. The bottom left, you'll see the deaf man, so the man who was playing the deaf defendant in that particular case. And then on the right, you'll see the interpreter, who was based at the Community Relations Commission. And you can see straight away that the background behind the interpreter is appalling, because they actually had the logo of the Community Relations Commission kind of dotted over the screen behind her, which is something that we couldn't control for at the time. So if you look closely, round the top square, there's a very faint blue line, and that actually depicts who is talking at any one time. So through their inherent AVL system, when someone talks, each microphone is voice activated, and when the voice is activated, it sends a signal to the camera, which is focused on that location, and the camera picks up on that signal, so that the visual then gets the blue line. So it's actually quite good for deaf people who are watching the camera, because they actually know who is talking at any one time, but it also has other implications, which I'll talk about a bit later on. On the photograph on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slide, you'll see that's the view from the judge's bench. So the judge actually had a screen on their table where they could see the same thing. So they could see the deaf person, the interpreter, and themselves in that screen. And that's what everybody could see. Now in this situation, the deaf person was in a remote witness suite, and the screen that he was looking at, he was sitting on a desk, and the computer screen was a reasonable size, but it was just a kind of standard desktop computer-sized screen. It wasn't particularly large, and he commented that he found it hard. If you imagine you had the 3 different views on that screen, it meant that the view of the interpreter was actually quite small on that screen. The interpreter, however, was in a video remote suite and was sitting in front of a very large plasma television screen. So again, if you imagine the 3 quadrants, the deaf person was actually a lot larger, and she felt quite comfortable in the situation where she was and would be able to see everything that she needed to see. So let's look at the second scenario. This is where the interpreter was remote. So the deaf person was in the courtroom, and the interpreter was in the Deaf Society of New South Wales's video remote interpreting suite. You'll see on the left-hand quadrant on the PowerPoint screen, which is the one that's got the blue line around it, that this was the view that the interpreter had in the video remote suite that she was in. Again, she was sitting with a very large plasma screen in front of her, so she didn't feel that there was an issue in terms of the size of the views that she was getting. And she could see the deaf person sitting at the bar table, so sitting with their lawyer at the bar table, and then also herself. Now, when we first tested that, we realised that as soon as the deaf person was asked any questions, he couldn't see the interpreter from that position. So we actually had to move him into the witness box. And that's what you can see in the second photo on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint slide. So the top right-hand little quadrant, you actually see the deaf person sitting in the witness box. But then because he was in that box, the only combination we could have so that the deaf person could be seen by the interpreter in the remote suite was to pick the 4-camera view rather than the 2-camera view. So the 2-camera view had problems when the deaf person was sitting at the bar because they were too far away, and also from where they were sitting, the plasma screen was actually sort of up on their left-hand side, so they would have had to kind of crane their head to actually be able to see the TV clearly enough. And also, if you can imagine, the interpreter could hardly see them because they were too far away from where the camera was positioned and they couldn't zoom in. So by moving the deaf person into the remote witness box, they could be seen clearly, straight head on. Couldn't zoom in, so they were still quite far away. But the deaf person was now positioned directly opposite the plasma screen, so he could actually see the interpreter on the full screen, just the interpreter. That was the way that the system works. So the deaf person felt very comfortable because he could see the interpreter very, very clearly. The interpreter said it was okay seeing him because she was sitting in front of such a large plasma screen. The deaf person was actually quite large, but because the screen was divided into 4, she could see herself, which she found very distracting. And the other interpreter also commented on that as well, that she could see herself in the screen right in front of her. But also there was this sort of view of the public gallery, and you can actually see me kind of sitting there trying to look like I'm not there. But I was sitting there in the public gallery, which is not a view that we need to have. But also, if you notice, behind the deaf person, behind the witness box, there were these sort of wooden slats as a background, and it actually meant that there was a kind of a strobing effect on the TV screen, which found it really hard for the interpreters to read when he was signing. The third scenario was a little bit better in that the deaf person and the interpreter were both in the same location together, so they were in the remote witness room together. The only problem we found was that they had to sit close enough together so they could both be seen on the screen, because there's only one video camera, and so if they sat too far apart you can only see one or the other. So the judge would require to be able to see both of them. So it meant that they actually had to be quite intimate, because they were sitting quite close together. Their knees were almost touching, you can just about see from the picture on the PowerPoint slide. And luckily they actually knew each other, this deaf person and the interpreter knew each other quite well, and it was a simulated situation. But imagine if it was a real trial, and it was a remote witness room where there was either a very distressed witness or you were in a remote facility in a jail. I couldn't imagine any interpreter wanting to get this close to somebody that was in jail. So that was a key issue that we felt as soon as we did it, but we went ahead with the scenario. The other problem we found in this context was that the microphone was placed on the table where the video camera was and where the TV was, but because the deaf person and interpreter had to sit far enough away so they could be seen, the microphone didn't pick up the voice of the interpreter. So when the deaf person started signing, when she was asked a question and she would respond, the interpreter started to voice over her response, and the microphone didn't pick it up. So in the court, they couldn't hear what was being said. And the only way we could get it to work was by me kneeling on the floor, picking up the microphone and sort of standing sort of out of sight of the camera, but close enough to the interpreter and holding the microphone so that they could be heard in the courtroom. So you can imagine that that wouldn't be very realistic in the situation if it was real life. And when we shared these findings with somebody else more recently, somebody said, well, why didn't you wear a lapel mic? And I said, well, in the ideal world we would, and that would be fine, but we were testing the existing conditions. We were testing the existing technology in the system, in the AVL system, in the New South Wales courts. So there was no lapel mic available to be used, which is one of our recommendations in this study, as you can imagine. Scenario 4 was quite straightforward. That was our test control, where we had everyone in court. That's what usually happens. And we just wanted to make sure that we had that to compare to the video remote aspects. So I won't talk about that in any detail. The deaf person and the interpreter were both there, and they were situated where they could both see each other, and there were no issues there. The last scenario is where we actually had the interpreter inside the courtroom and the deaf person was in a remote witness room. And again, you'll see the problem that we had is that the only place where we could situate the interpreter where they could be seen by the deaf person in a remote location was in the witness box. Now, that wouldn't be feasible for an interpreter to be sitting in a witness box the whole time, because when trials are run, witnesses need to stand, give their evidence from a witness box. But it was the only place where the deaf person could actually see them straight on, like as I described earlier on, because of the plasma screen, where the witness box was situated, the deaf person could see them directly. If the interpreter had been anywhere else and we couldn't move the cameras, the deaf person just wouldn't have been able to see them. We also had that strobing effect behind the interpreter again, which was an issue. And the key thing here was that because we had to use that 4-view option, the deaf person was in the remote witness room, and I described it earlier, where there was just the kind of conventional desktop computer-sized screen, and this screen was then divided into 4 quadrants. The deaf person could see themselves in their bottom right-hand corner, and they could see the interpreter in the top right-hand corner. And again, they could see the public gallery, which is not needed, and the judge's bench. And the interpreter, the deaf person actually said in an interview afterwards that she found it incredibly hard and really stressful to figure out what was going on, because the interpreter, what that she could see was this big. So she found it a real strain to be able to follow what was going on. And at one point we noticed a very clear miscommunication, a very clear potential for communication breakdown, because she was asked a question, and I was in that remote witness room with her doing the filming, and the deaf person was asked a question, and there was a big long pause, and she was looking at the screen, and then she went, "Oh, it's me," and she looked down at her script and she realised that she'd been asked a question. She was able to locate on the script where we were up to, therefore what the question was, and she responded. And if that had not been a scripted scenario, she wouldn't have been able to do that. She had no idea what was going on, and she was kind of following, but she was concentrating so hard on just trying to follow that she missed her cue, and found it difficult to respond. And she commented on that afterwards, that she felt quite confused and she felt disempowered and she felt very isolated being in this situation. And she did comment that it might be different if she could see the interpreter on a bigger screen, but just the conditions that she was operating under, she found it very, very hard. So just to sum up, I'm going to talk about 4 key areas, 4 key issues. We'll identify technological issues, and I've already mentioned some of them, linguistic issues, environmental issues, and logistical issues. Technological issues, we found that just the time to set things up would, I think, be prohibitive in some respects. We talked about wanting to try and test a real situation where a technician or a court clerk could literally press a button, but we found it actually took a lot of time to figure out who needed to sit where the interpreter could go and which camera could be seen by them. And we were only using one courtroom, and even though the AVL system in the New South Wales courts is uniform, so they have the same system in all the courts, each courtroom might have a very slightly different layout. So the witness box might be in a slightly different location, or the plasma screen might be on a different wall. So that's always something to have as a consideration, because there would always need to be some kind of set-up time with the technology and also where people were sitting or standing. The speed of the bandwidth, we felt was appropriate for the most part, but as I mentioned earlier on, the technician actually increased the bandwidth during one of the scenarios, and although we didn't notice any major impact on the outcome of the interaction, the visual was a lot better. You know, the higher the bandwidth, and as you would expect, the higher the bandwidth, then the better the visuals are going to be. So that is an issue to take into consideration, because they found that what they had to do was try and sync the different bandwidths of the different locations, because you have the 2 different agencies we were using plus the courtroom, and the remote witness room was in the same courthouse building, so but they had their own bandwidth, and the 2 other agencies had their own, so they all had to be synced to be operating at the same bandwidth, which meant that they weren't all as high as they could have been. I've already mentioned the size of the television screens and the fact that in the remote witness room they were just a conventional desktop computer screen, which meant that the views were very, very small, and the number of images on screen as well. I've mentioned the position of the microphone in the remote witness room, and that again might not be the case for every remote witness room, but it would be an issue. One of the other issues we found about the microphones that I mentioned earlier on, that they're voice activated, and when the deaf person was giving evidence from the witness box when he was in the courtroom, initially we said, how do we guarantee that the camera was on him and the interpreter could see him? And so initially we were just going to use the 2-view choice, but it would have meant that when he was giving his evidence, he would have had to tap the microphone to activate it, to give the voice activation, so that the camera would go to him and then the interpreter would be able to see him. But of course, when we initially tried that, he kept forgetting to tap the microphone before he spoke or signed. So we scrapped that and started again, and then went for the 4-view option, which meant that the camera was on him at all times, but that then reduced the size of the quadrant of view that the interpreter had. So there were issues there in using that technology. We actually found, and just as a hypothetical, that if a deaf person and an interpreter were together in the courtroom, even though that's the ideal, they're face to face, there's no way to actually record those interactions because the camera is fixed. So even if you wanted to use the AVL facility to record the interpretation just for preservation purposes, they have the note taking in the courtroom, so they always have a transcript of the court case, but you don't have a recording of the sign language interpretation. So it would make sense to be able to use the AVL system to do that, and at the moment you can't do that because of the fixed nature of the cameras. The next core area is linguistic issues that we noted. you would imagine that the size of the sign on the screen, because you had the different quadrants, meant that the size of the sign was very small, so sometimes it was hard to read what they were signing. And you know, people have often complained, especially students, as we know, of sign language, tend to complain of the two-dimensional nature of watching signing on a television screen, and it's harder to read anyway. So if you've got a person signing on a large screen, the larger the screen, obviously, the better, but people often struggle with that anyway. So when the person is reduced to this kind of size, literally, it makes it even harder to read. In particular, the interpreters found that it was hard to read the finger spelling of deaf people, primarily because the deaf person was located far away from the camera. So they were already far away, they were looking at them through a video screen, plus when they were finger spelling, you know, if you think about the micro level, the small movements involved in finger spelling, the interpreters commented that they found that very hard to read back. But the key issue for us, we found, was the attention getting and turn taking. We had one classic situation where the deaf person was in the courtroom, the interpreter was remote, the deaf person was asked a question, so the interpreter signed the question, and when the deaf person responded, he actually looked away and looked towards the judge, which I thought was very interesting. He was looking at the person that he was giving the information to. But what happened was that the interpreter missed one key bit of information and needed to clarify. Because he turned away, so the interpreter was kind of looking at the deaf person side on, and then what happened is the interpreter's trying to get his attention. He's not looking at the video screen, the TV screen, he's looking at the judge. So the interpreter's literally going, and then, you know, waving, and her waving is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, until eventually I think it was the judge who sort of looked up and saw on the screen that this interpreter's waving phonetically, and I think she noticed because she couldn't hear anything. She wasn't hearing the voiceover interpretation come through. So she looked, then the deaf person looked and went, "Oh, sorry, what?" And the interpreter went, "You know, go back," and then they sort of, she clarified the information she needed and they were able to proceed. But it was a really key issue for us that she couldn't get his attention. And in hindsight, through the interview, we talked about how she could have actually vocalised that and said, "I'm having trouble reading, I need to clarify with the deaf witness, could the judge please indicate to him to turn to the screen," or something. But in hindsight, she'd said, "Okay, of course I could have done something like that." But at the time, we're so used to sign language interpreters to getting deaf people's attention visually by waving or tapping. So that was her instinct, was to do that, because if she'd been face to face with him, that's what she would have done. And that was a very obvious communication breakdown that happened because of the distance of where she was and where he was, and the sort of technological barrier, if you like. The other small thing as well was that the deaf people found it hard, and also the interpreters did, around turn taking. When a question was asked, when the interpreter could come in and start to voice over what the deaf person was saying, or when they felt it was appropriate to start to respond, because there was a very slight delay through the AVL, so it meant that there tended to be pauses, slightly longer pauses than you would expect in straight face-to-face communication, and I think that some people found that a little bit unnerving. Environmental issues. I've already mentioned the background behind the witness box with the sort of strobing effect. Often we found that the lighting in the courtroom was quite bright, and there was only one setting, it was kind of on or off. And for the purposes of the video cameras, when you're actually looking at someone trying to read what they're signing, it actually meant there was a lot of glare, which the interpreters felt put a strain on their eyes when they were relying on trying to read what the deaf person was signing. I mentioned earlier on the problem with the microphones and the audio, and the microphones not being close enough to the interpreter so nobody could hear what they were saying. And there were occasions when the interpreter was in a remote location where they would sometimes struggle to hear what was coming from the courtroom if somebody spoke and maybe turned their face away from the microphone or didn't speak closely enough to the microphone, that their voice wasn't projected as loudly as it could have been. We identified some what we call logistical issues as a consequence of doing this research and the kind of issues that we found. The fact that interpreters would need to have specific training on how to interpret, not only in court, which we know is a general recommendation is that interpreters should have some kind of legal training, but also they need to be trained on how to use the AVL system or how to work with the AVL system, and to give them some kind of awareness of the limitations, what they have to be prepared to work with in that context, because it's very high stakes when you're in a courtroom, and the potential there for communication breakdown could have serious consequences. So the interpreter should be able to mitigate that as much as possible and be aware of what the limitations might be for them and for the deaf consumer, deaf client, and they could even prevent some of those from occurring if they're proactive, if they're aware of them in advance. We also identified a need for the interpreter and the deaf person to have a briefing session. We didn't include this as part of our research study because we felt that often an interpreter might grab a few moments with a deaf person, but it's not always feasible. And if they're in a remote location, you might have someone in jail perhaps being brought to the remote witness room at the time when the hearing is. They get stuck in the room, the video camera gets switched on and they go. But we did feel that the briefing session is really important, and the interpreters in particular wanted to be able to sit down, check, okay, to the deaf person, can you see me? Can you understand me? How will I get your attention? How will you get my attention? How are we going to set up some cues for be able to clarify with one another or get each other's attention? And the interpreters in particular felt it was really, really important for them to be able to do that. So that's something that we actually recommended as a result of this study. So in conclusion, I've only given you a very brief summary of the key issues that we found, but in conclusion we felt that the current AVL system in the New South Wales courts is not appropriate as it stands, primarily because of the technological limitations, the fact that the cameras are fixed, they can't be zoomed in and out, that the microphones aren't set up in a way which are conducive for interpreters to use. We felt that if the technological makeup, and sort of the system itself was better set up, that it actually could be quite effective, because each of the trial scenarios that we conducted, none of them completely fell over. None of them, there was no major miscommunication, apart from that one that I mentioned where the deaf person was in the remote witness room and she had to refer to the script to figure out where she was at. Apart from that, all of the other interactions were actually quite smooth. We had some issues around clarification and attention getting, but when the interpreter could read the deaf person and vice versa, the communication was very smooth, and you could see that it would actually be a very effective form of provision for giving access to sign language interpreting in courts. But we just felt that there were so many instances of technological barriers that we had to work with that the current system just doesn't seem that it would be an effective system to use, and if anything it could be detrimental on the experience for any deaf person in that situation. So we really felt that this system should only be used with extreme caution, and we recommended that BRI needs to be considered carefully in this particular context. In the New South Wales courts, we worked with the department to formulate a policy, and they have actually decided to trial the system, but the what they call the Justice Access Conference System team, so basically the people responsible for the AVL system, are now looking into upgrading the system and incorporating our recommendations around the size of video screens, the cameras and so on, so that it's more appropriate for sign language interpreting use. Because they said, look, when we installed this system, it was never designed for that. And we said, of course it wasn't. But now we're telling you that it's not appropriate. So they're actually looking at when they upgrade the system, they will incorporate a system that is suitable, more suitable. But for the time being, they are trialling the system. But we worked with them on developing a policy around what the trials should encompass. So we said that it shouldn't be used for hearings of more than 15 minutes, so very brief hearings. That the deaf person and the interpreter should have an opportunity to brief beforehand, to meet each other through the AVL, to make sure they could communicate and establish any cues for attention getting and things like that. And we also said that there should be some kind of instruction sheet for any clerk in the courtroom, so that they should be able to refer to that quickly and make sure that they've taken into account where the deaf person or the interpreter needs to sit or stand, if everyone can see each other, and allow time for that, and maybe brief the judge if necessary, so that can all happen before everything goes forward. So although we've recognised that in this particular context there were limitations, we did recognise that VRI has a huge potential for the provision of sign language interpreting services, and if the technology is right, then there's no reason why it couldn't work extremely well and very effectively. So I would suggest that I think VRI needs to be considered very carefully. Anyone considering using it, by all means, should consider using it because it's a very effective measure, but shouldn't just launch into it without consideration for all of the different factors, and some of those that I've talked about today. And the legal context, I think, would be very relevant in other contexts too. That just setting up the technology is not a quick fix solution. Even if you look at all of the technological requirements and get that right, there are other things that you need to consider, like the relationship between the deaf person in particular and the interpreter, and how they can relate to one another when they're at a distance, when they're remote from one another. And that ideally the technology does need to be tailored. It needs to be a bespoke system so that it can account for the needs of sign language, so the screens are large enough, the bandwidth is high enough, and so on and so forth. But just as an aside, after that project finished in 2010, and last year we wrote up the findings and submitted the reports, and some publications are coming out now, and we're giving conference presentations. I'm now involved in a separate study on legal interpreting, and we got permission to go in and observe court cases that have interpreters working in them, any interpreter. So I'm working with some other colleagues in spoken languages as well. So we've actually identified different cases happening where they have interpreters present. So I turned up one day to observe the court case, and it turned out that the sign language interpreters were in fact in a remote location, in a remote witness room, with the deaf person who was giving evidence, because she didn't want to be in the same room as the defendant. And it was a sexual assault case. And so I was able to, and it was actually a closed court, but they still let me in to observe. And so I was able to sit in the public gallery and look at, and it was in the same courthouse where we'd done the trial. It was in a different courtroom, but it's the same courthouse. So the setup was very similar. They had the large plasma screen. And so I was able to observe that interaction happening in an authentic situation. And it was really interesting to note that it did seem to go very well, but there were still some issues. The deaf person and the interpreters, there were two interpreters there taking turns. It was at least a week-long trial, and I think I was there on the second day. The deaf person and the interpreters were sitting opposite each other, but were very close to one another, as I said, because they could both be on the screen. The deaf person was very upset, very emotional, and so often would vocalise a lot when she was signing as well, which meant that affected the audio, and the audio kept dropping in and out because there was more interference from when the judge was speaking or the barrister or lawyer was asking a question and she was responding. There was also issues in the remote witness room. While I was observing, one of the interpreters specifically stopped and asked for the volume to be turned up somehow because they were struggling to hear what was going on in the courtroom. So they then spent a few minutes trying to figure out how they did that. The judge said, no, we can't do anything, it's all set up and it's all, that's as far as we can go. But they found out there was actually a volume control in the remote witness room which they could adjust to increase the volume in the remote witness room, but it took probably 5 or 10 minutes for them to figure that out. One of the key things I found as well was that when the interpreters needed to interrupt to clarify something, I could see, because I was bilingual obviously, so I can see what they were signing and I could hear what was going on. I could see them hesitate, and I think it's always hard in a courtroom anyway. Interpreters always find it hard to interrupt, to know when to interrupt and how to interrupt and who they should address when they want to interrupt to clarify something. But when the interpreters are remote, it's harder, I think, because they don't know where to look. At least when you're in the courtroom, you can use your body and turn to look at the person you're addressing, if it's primarily the judge, to request permission to clarify something. Whereas the interpreters were next to the deaf person, they were turning around and they couldn't necessarily see where everybody was sitting as clearly, and you could see that there was a sort of hesitation and uncertainty about how to do it, but they would still ask for clarification and be very polite in the way that they did that, but I could just tell that they weren't comfortable in the way they had to do that. One other issue that came up was that the defence lawyer was talking about some documentation. They had copies of text messages that had been sent between the deaf witness, the female witness, and the defendant, and he was going through a series of these, and it transpired that she was looking at the wrong page in the documentation, and the interpreter could tell that she was looking at the wrong page because he was there with her in the room, but the people in the courtroom didn't know, and there was obvious communication breakdown happening because she was looking at the wrong page, she couldn't see what he was talking about, the lawyer was getting a bit irritated, and in the end the interpreter intervened and said, I can see that she's looking at the wrong page, can you give me permission to actually show her which page to look at, to turn the pages for her, to assist her so that she can get to the right page, and then you can move on. And I thought that was really interesting that he chose to do that, because he was the only person that could have done that, because there was nobody else in that room with them that might, if it was in a courtroom, it might have become apparent from somebody else, one of the legal personnel in the courtroom, that she was looking at the wrong documentation. So I just thought that was interesting to note that there are always issues that we should be aware of when a video remote interpreting is used, and that in the courtroom situation in particular, when there are high stakes involved, that we should be very careful about how we use it. So just to sum up, I'd just like to acknowledge all of the people that were involved in the study. It was a really big, complex study, as you can imagine, but as I said, I've given a couple of readings that you can have a look at if you'd like some more detail, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions or you'd like to know more about the study or anything else that's come as a result of the study, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thanks very much.